Section 3 of Dad's Trip to Brisbane. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Son of the Exiles. Dad's Trip to Brisbane by Steele Rudd. Section 3. The Great Metropolis. Dad and Mother arrived in Brisbane at dusk and alighted at the Central Railway Station. Dad took his bag and, with Mother laden with parcels, went to seek lodgings. They were welcome to a boarding house on Wickham Terrace that Nora had recommended to them. A daughter of the woman who kept it taught in Kangaroo Point School with Nora. 'Twas a large house and a lively place to stay at. 12 boarders in it, 12 gentlemen boarders of different degrees and dress and dispositions. One was born with a gift for music and had the patience and courage to develop it. He used to spend his nights thumping "Alice, where art thou?" out of the piano. Another constantly mortified the landlady and made her miserable and unhappy. He would stay in on evenings she had company, reading the newspaper, and when the room was silent would straighten himself up and read aloud the house advertisements, dwelling on the comforts and accommodation with emphasis that made it sound like an indictment for perjury. And there was a luxurious lodger who always had a ball or something to go to, and used to return late in the night or at early mornings in a cab, and fly up the stairs pursued by the cabman. The others were harmless, quiet-living fellows who only growled about their shirts every week and gave notice to leave. Sweeney, a cheerful red-haired lodger coming from the Bath, discovered Dad and Mother mooching about the balcony. He didn't say good morning to them or anything. He stared with all his eyes and darted into a room as if they alarmed him. Then he and 3 of the quite harmless boarders poked their heads through a half-open door and grinned and grimaced at Dad and Mother. But Dad didn't notice them. Nor did he notice that they stole into the room of Doonan, the nasty member of the house. Doonan, who had lost a lot of sleep, was angry. In a loud voice he abused Dad and Mother and accused them of tramping about all night, and asked if they were elephants. Then he took observations of them and hammered on the wall of his room and called lustily for Jacobs, another lodger, to come and see Esau. The bell rang, and a host of gentlemen boarders with high collars and stiff shirts and soft hands trooped in to breakfast. The lady of the house, stout and stately, sat at the head of the table guarding a dish of sausages.
"So you've got some new lodgers, Mrs. Foley,"
said one, a thin satirical lawyer. The others sniggered. The lady coloured slightly, smiled, and asked Mr. O'Rourke what he would take. "Sausages, I expect," Mr. O'Rourke said, sadly seeing no second dish.
"Sausages for choice," the lawyer added, and there was more sniggering, and fresh colour came into the lady's face.
Doonan bounced in.
"Hello," he exclaimed. "Where's Esau?"
Sweeney spluttered and lost some of his tea. A small, big-footed girl, pouring out tea at a side table, giggled into the cups and scalded herself. The lady rebuked her. "Mary," she said, "Mary, behave." Mary bent forward to place a cup of tea beside the lawyer and broke out again in his ear and emptied a quantity of the boiling beverage into his lap. He sprang up and said, "Blast it!" and Mary was sent to the kitchen. Then came a noise as if someone was leading horses down the stairs, and Dad and Mother wandered in, looking as though they were afraid of being turned out again.
"Making a start?"
Dad said, pushing Mother to the front and removing his other hat, a broad-leafed felt trimmed with white calico. The gentlemen boarders looked up, then dropped their heads like curlews hiding in the grass, and at intervals stole glances at each other and at Mrs. Foley. Mother showed signs of uneasiness in the presence of so many strangers, and sat on the chair as though she distrusted it. She had no appetite, and would take only a cup of tea. But Dad squared himself and breathed noisily and took sausages every time. Conversation flagged. The rattle of cutlery was the only sound for a good while, until Dad stirred his tea with a knife and started to drink. Then Sweeney, who had no self-control, lost some more of his tea. Mrs. Foley looked distressed, but Doonan, who always knew when to say something, relieved her. "Was that you walking about early this morning?" he asked of the lawyer sitting opposite. The lawyer smiled and reached for the jam.
"Where was it?"
Dad joined in,
"Up here?"
pointing his fork, with a sausage impaled on it, at the ceiling. Doonan chuckled and said, "Yes."
"That were me,"
Dad answered proudly,
"but it weren't early.
turning to Mother.
Weren't it after 4?
Mother said timidly she thought it must have been. "I expect you are used to rising early, Mr. Rudd," said the landlady to Dad,
"Well,"
stowing away the sausage he'd been pointing at the ceiling.
"middlin', Mum. 'Bout 3 mostly. Dave, he gets up first, then Joe and Bill, they gets the cans ready, and Sarah, she sees to the tea for the yard, and—"
The boarder with the mania for music suddenly left the table. "A minute or two to spare," he said, addressing no one in particular, and threw himself down at the piano. The others swallowed their tea hurriedly and left. Dad had another sausage, some more bread, and his 4th cup of tea. Encouraged by the music, or the absence of the boarders, Mother tackled some bread and butter. Dad finished and shifted his chair beside the piano and stared into the face of the musician. The man of music became flustered and struck wrong notes. He wasn't used to being admired.
"What's that the tune of?"
Dad asked. Without shifting his eyes, the other shook his head as though he didn't know.
"What are you playing?"
No response, except a violent conglomeration of sounds. Dad waited till the storm was over, then put the question again. "Alice, where art thou?" the musician hissed, striking a run of discords and poking among the keys for the lost notes.
"Can you play the Wild Colonial Boy on that?"
Dad inquired. "Play the deuce," the musician said savagely, and jumped up and ran away. In the hall he encountered Mrs. Foley. "What is it?" he asked, turning his thumb in the direction of Dad, then went out into the street, working all his fingers in imaginary manipulation of the keyboard.